Gotcha.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Sports Medicine with the Rob. Nope, absolutely not. We're editing that one out because I completely messed that one up. All right, we're recording, but again, through a lot of video editing, I can actually do magic. Let's try that again. Welcome, everybody, to Sports Medicine with the Robs. I'm Rob.
And I'm Rob W.
I don't think he got the joke. Anyway, this week we're going to go into the wonderful world of return to sport. Now, I know what you're thinking. Return to sport after what? After injury? Well, seeing as we're now talking about tonight, the UFC fights coming back, we're talking about return to sport after COVID. How are we going to handle this? How are we going to do this? What's the best method? Who do you think has the best method? I know Rob has definitely been doing some research into best ways or how different leagues are proposing to come back, how different leagues are coming back. I know I heard today NASCAR is going to start their performances with no fans. And I think that's the general consensus among most sports leagues is that they're going to come back with no fans. You hear leagues like the NFL, they're going to pump in fan noises. I think in terms of that, it's going to be really interesting. But Rob is a big UFC fan, so I'm going to let him take the reins with the beginning of this because he's going to go into how the UFC is doing it. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Rob. Yeah, so like Rob said, I'm huge into the UFC. We both have a sporting background as well as our athletic training background. So my sport of choice growing up was I was a competitive martial artist for 17, 18 years. So this is something that I really like to dive into. So the UFC's last event before this whole COVID-19 thing started shutting down sporting events, or they thought it wasn't safe to continue, was the 14th of March, and had just about a 2-month layoff there. UFC 249 kicked off their return back on the 9th of May. And with that kind of kicked off an 8-day stint where they had 3 fight cards in those 8 days down in Jacksonville, Florida. For the UFC 249 card, they had purchased over 1,200 of the COVID tests, which was crazy to think of just for a one sport kind of thing. Basically, what happened from there is fighters got into town on a Wednesday, which was different because they'll normally come in Mondays. So they cut down roughly half the time that they're in the area. So they came in Wednesday, checked into the hotel, temperature screening, history questionnaire. Have you been in contact with anybody like that? To everybody's knowledge, only one fighter so far has ever answered yes to being in contact with anyone that potentially had coronavirus. That would be Ronaldo Jacare Souza. And we'll get a little bit more on him in a second here.
Now, was he the one? Was he the one with both him and his cornerman testing positive the last fight, or?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Correct.
Okay.
So it was him and his 2 cornermen that came in. He had a family member of his at the time that he had interacted with them didn't know that they had coronavirus, to my understanding. And then after they had left the area that he had been in with them, they figured out that they had coronavirus. So he came in, he told them up front, said, hey, I may have this. So they quarantined him and his 2 cornermen in the room. So that first card, they did a nasal swab and a finger prick for the antibodies for the blood test type thing on all the fighters, all the cornermen, everybody that was involved with the card. And at that time, only Jacare and his 2 cornermen came back positive. Each day they did temperature screenings, symptom screenings, that kind of thing. Everybody got a new wristband each day to make sure everybody was good.
Basically how we do skin checks with wrestlers.
Essentially, yeah. So once Jacare's test came back positive, they then mandated that after weigh-ins on Friday morning, afternoon area, everybody had to get the nasal swab again. And then at that point, nobody else tested positive. All the media members, staff, all the other fighters and cornermen, Jacare and his 2 cornermen were the only 3 out of the 1,200 tests that came back positive. go through the fight card. Everything's great. Those three fight cards, those other two fight cards. So it was a Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday set up. The other two cards on Wednesday and Saturday went off without a hitch. Nobody tested positive. All going through the same protocol as that. Now for tonight's card, UFC Fight Night, Woodley versus Burns. They are back in Las Vegas, Nevada at the UFC Apex Arena. Me and Rob have a little story about that, but that's okay. Fun fact, not open to the general public. We know that now.
We learned that one the hard way. Thank you, random Uber driver, for taking us there.
Yeah, man, he was clutch.
We tipped him well.
Tonight, though, definitely. So for tonight, though, they're doing a little bit more of a strict, or this week, they've done a little bit more of a strict protocol, and I'm going to assume that this is going to be the case for the next couple of cards as long as they're in at the Apex Arena there in Nevada. Is they're doing it's mandatory that they're doing 2 oropharyngeal, so the throat swabs this time instead of the nasal swabs. So everybody's doing 2. It's once upon arrival and then again once after weigh-ins. Once the athlete and their cornermen get into town, they have to. I forgot about it. I brain farted for a second there. Once they get into town, they have to immediately go to the athlete hotel. They isolate until the results of their nasal swab test, their throat swab test comes back. If they get a negative, they can go about their normal. They could go about their normal week. If it came back positive, which we haven't heard of anybody having this time, then they were going to have to wait for UFC medical staff to get in touch with them to see where they go from there, because obviously they can't fight. And then once everybody made weight yesterday, they had to take another throat swab. And then from that point, they were in the hotel, they were isolated, and they were not to leave at all before the UFC personnel came to bring them to the Apex for their fight. So
my big question to that is, I mean, it's thorough, right? Like obviously they're doing their checks and balances here, and they're making sure that there's nobody testing positive that they're going to put in the corner. The big question on my mind when it comes to that kind of stuff is that sustainable, right? Like that's a big process, and that's a big ask for a lot of people you have to quarantine yourself for a while. Now, I get it. These are professional athletes making a lot of money, but even then, those are professional level athletes. They have professional level access to professional level medical stuff. Our high schooler wrestlers, our high schooler footballs, are even college levels, that D3 that don't necessarily have the exposure. Are we going to be able to do that with all of our return to sport? Because I don't know about you, football, you get kind of close to the guy next to you, right? So if one person has it, you're putting everybody there at risk. So even if they test everybody at the beginning of the year, these are high schoolers, or these are college students, right? I think there's needs to be, they need to develop presently, I think they need to develop a test that is more, what is the word I'm looking for? I guess more rapid response than the current method, and having to do a nasal pharyngeal or oral pharyngeal swab on every high school athlete sounds absolutely miserable to me. And quite frankly, that would honestly fall on the athletic trainer to probably take the swab for sporting events at the high school level, because we are the medical professionals at the high school level. At most high schools that hire an athletic trainer, you could rely on the nurse for that, but at the same token, how do you mandate that, right? How do you get compliance with that with your athletes? And then how far off are we from a more rapid test? I guess those are my questions when it comes to that. I mean, you look at football, you look at basketball, the professional levels. Professional levels are a whole different world, right? They have the money, they have the means to do this kind of stuff. When you start piping in back, when you start letting people come back to the games, do you test everybody when they come to the games? Do you maintain. Obviously you still have to maintain social distancing for a while. That's not going to change for probably a good hot minute. But I also think there's definitely a disconnect between the pro levels, and our day-to-day majority of healthcare practitioners, athletic trainers on the front lines with sports and stuff like that. The question is can we make it feasible, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think, at least for like the rapid testing kind of thing, I mean, obviously I'm no expert in infectious disease or anything like that. That's why I'm sitting here still and not in the CDC in DC. But I
As soon
think
as
they
it's above my
could
pay
be
grade,
onto
I'm
something.
referring.
Yeah. I think it could be on something with like the antibody test, because essentially it's just a finger prick, um, much like what diabetics do for their sugar testing. So, is there a way that we can kind of use that to segue us into a more rapid test for the virus itself?
How many parents are you going to get to comply with the finger prick testing for their kids? Right? Like, we already have a lot of compliance with getting physicals. I mean, we get the physicals, but the fact that we'd have to finger prick every practice, every kid, you're going to have that. I mean, that's evasive as it is. And like, quite frankly, that's a lot of work on our end to make sure that gets done too. Right. To return safely. So yeah, we could look for antibodies, but it's I guarantee you it's not going to be cheap right off the bat, right? So only the schools that have the funds to do it will be able to do it. It's the compliance is not going to be there. There's no doubt in my mind the compliance on that is going to be super low, and we're going to get a whole bunch of mad parents. Now, I'm always one to say the parent is. I mean, when it comes to their kid, the parent's right? Like I'm never going to argue that. Like, you know what's best for your child, right? I get it 100%. But if they don't choose to participate because they don't want to get a finger prick, I don't blame them. Like, I mean, it's invasive, right? Like, the safety of it, of the whole thing is, there's a fine line to walk, I guess, with it. And is probably what I'm trying to say the best, right?
Yeah.
Because it's an invasive test. Right. It's the same as like, oh yeah, we need to make sure, you don't have, as much as we like to say it, ringworm with wrestling, right? We see ringworm, but that's easy. It's like, oh, you have ringworm, you're not competing, right? How many parents have come up to you after you get ringworm and be like, can't you just kind of sign it off? They started the medication yesterday. They're good now, right? No, they're not. We need to quarantine and make sure they're not wrestling. They can keep up with their cardio and stuff like that, but they have to be isolated with this kind of stuff. I don't see a lot of parents agreeing with, invasive procedures like that. Like, oh, you're telling me my kid has to be finger pricked every day. Like, quite frankly, if I was a parent, I'd be a little skeptical of it. It's a invasive test every single day with team sports. Individual sports is a whole nother issue. Tennis is going to have one of the easiest comebacks in the world. I think NASCAR actually had a pretty okay comeback, right? Like the fact, like the individual sports, yeah. UFC, as close as they are to each other, they're easy to test, right? So that's going to be easy peasy. And even like WWE, that's, it's filmed, it's scripted and stuff like that, but that's easy to come back because they're all, paid professional athletes. I think the sports we're going to see come back first are going to be the easiest from this, are going to be your individual sports, right? Because you don't need to 100% test them every day because they can practice social distancing and still practice their sport, right? Tennis, you have a full court between you and the next person.
Right. I mean, yeah, team sports are definitely gonna have a little bit of a more difficult comeback. But I mean, I guess that's just kind of the boat we're in right now until, like you said, we can find a more rapid test and one that's um, a little more consistent as well. As the ones we have right now, to the best of my knowledge, still are inconsistent at best, getting false positives, false negatives, or even could be the case of having a true negative and then the person the next day comes in contact with something that they contract the virus from. I mean, right now there's just, even in the medical community, I feel like there's still some questions that we don't have answers to because we don't have all the questions to have the answers to.
Correct. I agree. I definitely think return to youth sports is probably going to be a little bit longer. Proper return to youth sports is going to be a little bit longer than what people are thinking, just because of the steps that need to be in place in order for youth sports to kind of come back, right? Like I said, professional sports is a different monster. These guys are being paid to do this. They have those owners, those billionaire owners are paying for the top of the line medical stuff. They got testing before anybody else did. Like, hence the reason the NBA season got canceled, right? Like, immediately they tested and boom, canceled right away. And then as soon as that happened, you saw that domino effect, that chain, it trickled down, right? I think pro sports coming back is a good thing, because I think people need sports in their lives. I think sports fans need sports in their lives, right? It is an identity for a lot of people. And I know listening to radio, I listen to a lot of sports radio talk show on in my drives and stuff like that. And when there's no sports content, like what do you do, right? Like there's a couple shows that
right now we're resulting in cornhole. So
right. Well, again, the individual sports, well, the two-person sports kind of thing. I definitely think the return is going to be interesting. I think we're probably farther off. And it also begs the question of, as soon as you see one kid that has it, do you have to shut down the program for the rest of the year, basically? Or because if one kid's infected, right, you got to assume they hung out with their friends who are usually their social group, who are usually not, their friends are their social group. I guess English is not great for me today. But their friends are usually also on their teams with them. So they've been hanging out with them. So if they have it, you probably safe to assume that the others have been in contact with them. Even if they don't have it, they've been in contact with them, right? Do you have to shut the whole program down just to stay safe? And how many positive tests is too many positive tests, right? Going back to pro sports, these pro sports start going live, right? Like NHL, gonna make it a comeback with the playoffs. You hear talks of NBA's commissioners are talking about a comeback. Baseball, that's a whole nother monster, and we're not going to touch on baseball because that's the whole owner-player dispute and whatever. We're not touching that one. But you get
beyond our realm.
When you start talking billions of dollars, I'm an athletic trainer. I don't know what that means. All right. But you see, you get what happens when somebody on one of the teams tests positive, right? Do you shut down the league for the rest of the year? Well, you just made all these plans to come back, and then all of a sudden, day 2, you're right up the gutter. You know what I'm saying? It's just not how many. I guess the best way to put it is, how many positive tests are you expecting during this return to pro sports?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, to your point, for like high schools and schools coming back and, kids, one kid tests positive. He's obviously been around his friends. Worst case scenario on that one is, what if, athletes are always friends with other athletes. What if that kid his friend doesn't play on his team. So now he's tested positive, but he's been around with this other kid, and that other kid's now been around his other team, like
Right.
his teammates on the other team. Are we now down 2 sporting programs? I mean,
Yeah, you have two friends. One plays football, the other plays soccer. They shut down all sports because one kid tests positive, right? Like,
right.
I don't have the answers to that, right? Like, that's above my pay grade. I don't act like I'm not trying to act like I know the answers to any of this, because quite frankly, I don't think really anybody knows the answers to these. This is why watching these pro sports come back is super interesting, and it's going to be, I guess, a good barometer of how to return, right? Because I mean, you watch everything. Everything from the pros ends up trickling down. A lot of stuff that happens in the pros ends up in college, and then ends up becoming a mainstay with the sport. Look at some of the football rules. Look at some of the baseball rules, right? Like it starts at the top, and then it's basically trickle down economics from there, right? Like as soon as the lower levels are like, oh, this actually works, they're like, okay, cool. And the pro sports, the pro owners, they have the money to take those kind of risks. They're gonna have the viewership no matter what, right? Like if college makes a bad decision and football tanks because college football made a bad decision, a lot of sports revenues for the college that come from football, that come from basketball, all of a sudden, again, same thing, right down the gutter. So I definitely think this return to pro sports is going to be interesting to watch and unfold, to see how are we feasibly going to be able to do this at a lower level is my question with this.
Yeah, and I think, if we can at least get some of the trends, some of the more easily accessible to the general population trends that I'm sure even the pro athletes are into, the temperature screenings, the symptoms checklist, that kind of thing. I think even if we can get something like that kind of situated and rolling in like a high school setting or lower D3 college setting, that could be promising for us to come back. And I mean, even from there, there's always the thing of maybe that's not enough. Maybe, even then we don't catch everything. But I mean, there's always going to be that instance of we don't catch everything. I mean, even with the pre-participation exams and screenings that we have now, we still don't catch everything. There's still athletes, that have the sudden cardiac arrest that were like they on their screening, on their physical, everything's perfect. Like he should be a perfectly healthy kid. Nothing should be, he shouldn't be experiencing anything like this. And then boom, something just pops up. So, I mean, I think there's always going to be that mystery out there. It's just to what level are we comfortable with that mystery?
And especially, like I said, at the pro level, they have a staff of doctors, staff of athletic trainers, stuff like that. Colleges, they usually have 2 to 3, like they have 1 athletic trainer per sport, and each sport is relatively small. High school, most high schools, it's 1 athletic trainer for at least one of the schools around here, they have 600 athletes, right? Now that's the entire year. Do you expect the 1 athletic trainer to test every athlete every day, to screen every athlete every day? Because there's going to be, as good as an athletic trainer could be, there's going to be missed kids that don't show up. And then you're trying to scramble to find them but they didn't tell you they're just going home that evening. They're not actually, they have a prior commitment, but you have to go scrambling for them, or they just went straight to practice without coming to you because they thought it was a whole stupid thing that they had to do. It's a lot of extra work for one person who already has a hectic job as an AT, right? The fact that, we're already doing documentation on injuries, which, I mean, we should be doing. It's 100% necessary that we're, injury screening, doing documentation, stuff like that. The weekly skin checks for wrestlers, even the preventative stuff that most ATs should be doing at the high school level to kind of help prevent injuries and stuff like that. But to test every single kid every single day when you're an AT with a couple hundred athletes to deal with, that's a lot of work. I mean, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even, the high school that I'm at, was on the lower end of athletes that, I've ended up working with throughout a whole year. But even with that, I still think it would be, a difficult process, at least in the beginning, until you can start kind of getting the kids to get on board and get the feel for the new flow of how things will go, at least for the time being. I
It's
think
like
if
ankle taping before a
that's the
game,
situation,
like your football team, right?
yeah,
Like
yep,
it's the problem is you're gonna have to triage people, right? Like, okay, you guys have a game today, your priority, and then once they're done, you come in. How much extra time does that add? Because you already don't have a lot of time from when school ends to when sports begin, right? Like practices and games and stuff like that. That's not a big window of time. That's having to do pre-tests like that take a good amount of time. And I think that begs the question is, I think it should justify full-time ATs or somebody in the school who can do the screens before actually school ends. If you're an athlete, a couple suggestions, but I don't have the answers on how to make it feasible and safe.
or I mean, or even if we have the coaches help with that kind of thing. And I know that gets tricky because you get, there are still coaches out there that are, this kid's our star kid, like he's got to play, like
you have 100-degree, you have 100-degree fever, you're good, like it's fine.
Yeah, it's the middle of August, everybody's got 100-degree fever, like no, not really.
I'm waiting
like,
for that. Yeah, not, right.
That's not a normal thing to have. So I mean, granted, there are still those coaches out there, but possibly getting the coaches, at least have them like outside your office or somewhere in the close vicinity where if something, you can catch on to something that's like, that doesn't sound right, you can at least pop out or, say, hey coach, can you come in here? Like what was,
and
Johnny's temperature or whatever,
Who are we putting in charge of the regulation of testing, right? Like, is that going to be on each individual school's AD? Is that going to be on the governing board, like for the case of Delaware, DIAA? Is that going to come from straight up the governor, right? Like, who's in charge of that, right? I would assume because they handle all the medical stuff. You're the governing sports board, so Delaware would be the DIAA, right? But for others, each individual state is handling everything differently. So what if you have an out-of-state competition, which happens, right? Especially in basketball, right? Especially at almost all sports. I know quite a few football teams, they go out of state for preseason scrimmages. Especially and then how do you mandate the private schools too, right? Like there's a whole bunch of factors that go into this that don't necessarily make this an easy return.
Right. And I think on that one, I think it would have to, because of the private school aspect and, the out of state aspect, I think it's just got to come down to like the state health boards themselves, because they have a lot more communication interstate with other, state med boards and everything like that than, states, high school, interscholastic sporting boards do. So, I mean, I think that would have to come down to the state's board itself, and they work in with, their individual states, high school athletic association there. And then that way there's better communication between states. And then obviously once we get to a point where everything's back to as close to normal as we're going to get, that kind of aspect of it is taken back off the table. And everything kind of just flows in the new normal state that we have.
I think,
but I mean, that would be my best guess at how this could be, the easiest transition in that period.
I think the best way for you, at least youth sports, high school sports, you name it, to come back feasibly is more rapid testing, or like a better rapid test. Now, I don't know how far that off that is. I don't know how feasible that's going to be, right? Like, again, I don't have that kind of knowledge or answers to that, and I don't want to make it seem like I do. But other than like a rapid testing, it's going to be hard for these sports to come back. And like the more I'm thinking about it, I think it's going to be hard for these fall sports to come back, because fall sports come back, cool. 2 people now test positive on your teams, right? Do you have to shut down the whole state again? Right? Because especially if they went and practiced or scrimmaged another team, right? Who has been in contact with who does what, who does where, right? Like I know plenty of kids have friends from other schools too. So there's a lot of questions, and I don't think we have the answers to yet. And I think that we kind of just have to leave it up to the doctors and scientists that are kind of coming up with this testing, kind of coming up with to kind of make our jobs a little bit easier, and help us with this. Because if there's a second wave of this, right, and they cancel fall sports and they cancel fall college programs, right? Like most of the revenue for college sports comes from football and basketball, right? If they cancel football for colleges, especially big school, SEC schools, Big Ten schools, stuff like that, you're going to see a hit to a lot of these places, to their sports department, to their sports staffing, not even just the athletes. Like, I mean, yes, the athletes are important, and the fact that they're not going to get their chance to play maybe their senior season, devastating, right? Like, especially if this is where they're like, yes, I'm a college football player, right? I'm a D1 college football player. But you'll see more layoffs at the college level, straight up, if they don't have the funding to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's going to be a big hit. And then, into basketball season could be a big hit, and like you said, with the seniors, especially those guys that are, on the bubble coming out of their junior year of, maybe being draft eligible or draft worthy, those guys that are relying like, all right, senior year, it's go home, go big or go home time, I'm going to show up this year and go get that contract and be in the league, how does that affect them? How does that affect, the scouting class for the new draft class coming up?
That affects a very small percentage of college athletes. And so like that has to be prefaced. Like not everybody's going to be like, yeah, no, I'm going pro. Like we get that there's the top of the top, yes. Right? Like, but to that point, there are also the guys that are there on that bubble that could be draft worthy. That, right. Their senior year could make or break on that athlete scholarship, to the sports scholarship to go to college, right? Like if the funding in sports isn't there, do they lose their scholarship and then all of a sudden they can't continue their college education? And that might have been the only way they could have afforded college, is because they worked their whole lives to perfect this craft, right? There's definitely a bigger scope to this. I think with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Do you have any final comments, Rob?
No, just everybody stay safe out there. Hopefully we can get, some good testing in here and we can bring all levels of sports back. And from there, we can kind of get back to life as normal, but just everybody stay safe.
Thank you all so much for stopping by. If you really like this, please like and subscribe. It would really mean the world to both of us. And again, this is Sports Medicine with the Robs. I'm Rob M.
And I'm Rob W.
And have a safe and healthy day. Stay active.